Okay, as Paul has said, I have been doing this kind of stuff for a long time, mainly earthquakes. Last few years, a lot of tsunami work and kind of do volcanoes on the side. Okay. Basically, a geophysicist, earthquake scientist, and very much involved in going from basic research, how we do things, taking it right through. I have been, for the last 20 years, a member of the Standing Committee on Earthquake Design, which puts stuff into the building code and provides the seismic map for the building code. Regularly interacting with the kinds of companies like our NEPTUNE that the insurance industry deals with. So, putting the fundamental information in the front end, they may interpret it different than we do, but mostly the same. So what I'm going to do today, I understand we have about an hour and a half. I'm not going to talk an hour and a half. I'm hoping questions will come from you people here, because the real purpose, I think, here is to answer your questions about the subject. Basically, I'm going to divide the talk into 3 parts. And the first part is going to be an earthquake lesson, why and where we have earthquakes. The second part, I'm going to deal with the topic, as in there is some recent earthquakes that are more relevant to Canada, and which parts of them are more relevant to Canada. And the last one, I just want to say a few things about the last big earthquake we've had in Canada, because a lot of people aren't aware of it. Okay, which was just about a year ago. Let's carry on, push the right button. Okay, earthquakes per se are mostly around the world along the edges of these big tectonic plates that we have. Big solid areas that have few, but have some earthquakes inside them. You can see the mid-Atlantic ridge aligned out here where North America is going that way and Europe is going this way. You can see the west coast here, all the way down to South America, which is very active with earthquakes. I say most of the earthquakes occur on plate boundaries. Often around the Pacific is called the Rim of Fire because there's earthquakes and volcanoes, and certainly Canada's, whoops, it's back up here, Canada's west coast is part of that. Volcanoes like Mount St. Helens that erupted in 1980, north of Vancouver, Mount Garibaldi is one of the big volcanoes to the north. But from California to northern Vancouver Island, there are volcanoes as well as earthquakes. So we're part of this thing. Everybody always assumes earthquakes occur elsewhere around the Pacific Rim of Fire, and volcanoes occur elsewhere, but indeed they occur in Canada too. Here's a list of a map of earthquakes in Canada. The bigger the dot, the bigger the magnitude. You can see in the bottom here. And most of Canada's earthquakes, 3/4 of them, are on the west coast. The biggest ones are on the west coast, but indeed we have some earthquakes in the east here. This is not a plate boundary. This is the active plate boundary out here. Why do we have these earthquakes? Well, because the mid-Atlantic is spreading, as I said, and North America is kind of trying to move west, the whole continent is squeezed in an east-west direction. And these are all lines of weakness along the St. Lawrence Valley and along the Ottawa Valley that are inside the continent. And so as the whole continent is squeezed, earthquakes pop out in the weak places. But to say, by far, the majority of earthquakes are along this west coast system and up into the Yukon. So why do we have earthquakes along the west coast? What's the nature of the plate tectonics? Well, there's 2 big players and 1 small player here, the small player being very important. One is the big Pacific plate, this blue thing which is moving past North America like these arrows indicate. North America, or American plate, is what we're standing on right now, what people in Vancouver are standing on. And we have very large earthquakes, which we'll talk about near the end, along the San Andreas Fault, as you know, which wiped out San Francisco in 1906. And Canada's largest historic earthquake has occurred on the Queen Charlotte Fault, and indeed the earthquake I'm going to talk about at the end, last October, a magnitude 7.7 earthquake, which is not a small earthquake, occurred along. This curve here is, we'll get to that at the end of the talk. Now, in between here, which is where most of the people live in British Columbia and where most of the infrastructure and buildings are exposed to earthquakes, there's this third little plate, which is actually going towards North America like this and sliding under it. Now, to look at that a little easier way, we'll use this cartoon. So there's your Juan de Fuca plate here. It's created out here where new material is coming up, creating a whole line of undersea volcanoes out here, moves sideways, slides under North America, gets to a certain depth. Conditions are right for from melting, and you get these volcanoes all the way down the coast. So this process is relentless. It keeps going. It kind of goes at the rate of your fingernails growing, or the length of your body in your lifetime, if you want to put it in another perspective. It doesn't stop. But what happens is parts of it, like along the boundary here, get stuck. And they get stuck for very long periods of time, and then they break loose. But while they're stuck, the plates are still moving towards one another and causing stress in that whole area. So there's lots of other earthquakes, some of which can be quite big and do damage. So that's the kind of cartoon picture of the tectonic setting. Here's another way to look at the same cartoon. Like I said, the plates keep moving. They do get stuck here. Certain areas are forced down, just like taking a piece of paper and moving it. You'll get a big bump in the middle if you move the two edges together. And certain parts are forced up. And this goes on for centuries. And in the meantime, there's a lot of stress in the whole region, causing other earthquakes. And then at some point, it's all released within a couple of minutes. And what went up now goes down, what went down now goes up. And clearly offshore, this vertical motion gives you a large tsunami. And the last giant earthquake we had on the west coast of that type was a magnitude 9 and occurred in 1700, January 26, actually at 9 o'clock in the evening. This was before European contact, but the reason we know that is because this wave went across to Japan. They had good timekeeping and good record keeping in Japan. And that time in Japan, they were aware that tsunamis were associated with earthquakes, and this was unusual, called an orphan tsunami, because there was no earthquake. Just this giant tsunami showed up and did a lot of damage along the coast of, east coast of Japan. So calculating that backwards to here, it came from Cascadia, rupturing from northern Vancouver Island to California, and about magnitude 9 in terms of the amplitude of the tsunami. So that's kind of that picture. So let's just review what I've tried to say. So on the west coast, there are three kinds of earthquakes. One, these giant earthquakes that occur mainly offshore here, or almost entirely offshore, and they occur on the intervals of centuries, an average of every 500 years. We know for the last 10,000 years, there were 19 events. Some being as close together as 200, some being as far apart as 1,000 years, but the average is about 500. So we're 313 years since the last one. We're certainly beyond the minimum, but we're not yet to the average, and we're a long way from the long time. So those are the giant earthquakes. The next kind of earthquakes are the crustal earthquakes, the shallow earthquakes. And these earthquakes are particularly intense along the west coast. These are the most damaging kinds of earthquakes because they're right up near the surface. And indeed, we've had two big ones on the west coast in the historic time, and there have been earthquakes in eastern Canada that are shallow earthquakes. So these are the ones that cause the most damage because, again, they're right up close, and if they happen to be near your city or your piece of infrastructure, you've got a problem because the shaking is very strong. You've got a problem if the design of whatever it is not taking earthquake resistance into account. You can design against earthquakes, but you need to know what the design criteria are. So the shallow earthquakes are this, and then on the west coast, uniquely, we have these third kinds of earthquakes, which are the deep earthquakes. And these here are in a very narrow belt, down beneath Vancouver, Seattle, Victoria. They're about 50 or 60 kilometers down in the earth, so that means they're 50 or 60 kilometers away from you. By the time you get 50 or 60 kilometers away from an earthquake on the surface, you know, the damage is down considerably, right? So they don't do really spectacular damage, but they can do a lot of damage. But they are unique to the west coast. And what's happening there is as the plate is sliding down underneath, it keeps going, besides the fact that it happens to be stuck, and, you know, elastic deformation in here because it's stuck. What happens is as you get denser and denser into the earth, the molecules rearrange themselves. The volume of the rocks actually change because they change from one type of rock to another. This causes stress in the rocks, and that causes earthquakes.
Gary?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, by all means, answer all questions whenever you want. Yeah.
Can I invite you to briefly share with us a little bit of the history of the certainty of knowledge about earthquakes? For example, the work on plate tectonics, which is behind the Ring of Fire and all of that knowledge. It still is during our lifetime. really old science compared to some other areas. And then knowledge about Cascadia and the time frame for how certain are we now today with the seismology of Western Canada?
We're I would say very certain, okay? You don't know when the next earthquake is going to happen. Yeah, plate tectonics was really born in the 1960s. When I went through as an undergrad, it hadn't been hatched yet. When I was in graduate school doing my master's, it came on the scene and was a fantastic explanation of everything, and everybody bought into it. And then as it's evolved in the last 50 years, more and more evidence from very different, diverse fields. It's still called a theory, as we call it in science, but it's just unrefutable, right? And the West Coast really came into an understanding of this Cascadia situation, really started in the 1980s. And again, when I wrote my PhD thesis, which was in the early 80s, it was just starting to be understood, right? And we really didn't understand we had huge earthquakes until really the mid-1980s. Our group in Victoria was one of the first people to realize this and start with very limited evidence, but now the evidence is everywhere, particularly the paleoseismic evidence, which shows the deposits have been left down by the earthquake. We can measure this deformation that I was talking about now. We know it's deforming. We know it's deforming this way. We can measure it. We know that certain parts are going up in a pattern that's exactly predictable. Say we can find the last earthquakes, and the rates of earthquakes that we see correspond to the plate tectonic model. So there's no real doubt about the general framework. There's still doubts about some of the details, but this happens, and it has happened many times in the past, and it's not going to stop just because we live here now. Okay.
And one of the implications of that history is that the actions we've done, how we design buildings or whatever, has also been evolving to take this knowledge in, but wasn't always available.
That's right. So the building code has evolved. The first building code in Canada was really 1953, I guess, and that was just there are earthquakes, we should design buildings. In other words, buildings being designed to resist earthquakes before 1953. People knew there were earthquakes. Companies who were commissioning buildings, engineers were knowledgeable, saying we really should put some earthquake design into it. But guidelines or rules never came into the building code until 1953. And about the next big jump was 1970, when Canada had the first probabilistic building code in the world, right? And then other countries followed suit. And then there were major changes in the mid-'80s and early 2000s. And the next building code that's coming out in 2015 will again be a major change in the last 15 years. So the building codes have evolved to take into account both engineers looking at buildings and understanding what gets damaged and understanding what kind of shaking. My job is what kind of shaking and how much and what frequency ranges, and then the engineers take that, look at past buildings, and they now all have computer models on their desk to design things. But the building code gives a basic guideline for both engineers and for Joe Contractor to follow to make buildings earthquake resistant. And that has improved through time. The last building code had a significant improvement in terms of small buildings in requiring the percentage of wall area compared to window area to be fixed in buildings. You have to have, I think it's 25%, at least 25% of wall area nailed with a certain density compared to windows. I may be wrong on the 25%, but I think that's what it is. But the thing was to have a ratio that Joe Contractor would not exceed, right? You can exceed that if you want, but then you have to have an engineer to sign it off with your local building inspector, right? And so where the rubber meets the road and all of it, when you get to the building code stuff, is at the local building inspector level, who has the code in one hand and can deal with whoever's designing the building, right? And that's where things often run amok. We hope not in our country, but in some other countries where things happen, right? And the building code doesn't always get followed. Even though the building code is very good, it depends on the construction quality to go along with it and what's been followed. So that's kind of the end of the first part of my talk. That's why we have earthquakes. That's why earthquakes are more prolific on the West Coast. That's why we have earthquakes across the country. You had a question?
Before you go on, I thought the question was a very interesting one, because I come from the Caribbean. I'm originally a geologist.
Yes.
We've certainly followed the evolution of the plate tectonic details, because as you know, the Caribbean is a very special case because we use microplates, and it's in my own career, I've been on the building code committees and so on, and hence I'm very interested in how engineers understand the knowledge we now have of the processes. And I don't think earth science as a whole has completely succeeded in packaging this information and passing it on to our colleagues and partners on the engineering side. And I think it's still a challenge we have, because while the gross plate tectonic theory is clear, there's a lot of, the devil is in a lot of the details. And we've now seen in many cases earthquakes in the last 10 years, you know, exceeding what we thought were the maximum at particular plate boundaries. And a lot of engineers come back and say, but, you know, what does this mean for practice? And we haven't figured it all out yet. But I don't know if you agree, but I still
I do agree.
Work of passing that information.
The best thing
process.
The best thing that science can do is capture the information at the time it's capturing it, and give people the best information at that point in time. Science evolves as we get new information, and that may be different 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 15 years from now. Just like we did not know this subduction zone process existed prior to the 1960s, and did not know it existed on the West Coast prior to the early 1980s or late 1970s. So this evolves, and we try to capture this. In Canada, and certainly in the United States, the process is the building code engineers. Like in Canada, there's about 25 people sit on the Standing Committee for Earthquake Design. Most of those are practicing engineers. There's a subset of engineering professors, and then there's a few seismologists. And so there, the interaction is quite back and forth. And so the stuff that gets in the building code, hopefully, by that back and forth, captures what needs to be captured for the engineering point of view, with its uncertainty, right? But then you've got to take it to the general engineering community, indeed the general public, and Joe contractor who just says, I've got to have so many nails for 2x4, and you know, that's how the process goes. So hopefully it's a good process. We put stuff out, it gets a chance for everybody to have a kick at the cat for public review before the next building code comes. It'll be out in 2014. So the opportunity is there, but you're right, that it takes a while for all this information to get to the right place. Hopefully we're doing the best we can, and it does get to the right place. And by this iterative process at the top, what needs to be in the code is in the code. And by reviewing the code every 5 years, both from the engineering point of view and the science point of view, the opportunity comes up every 5 years to change stuff. And you can always have emergency changes, but to let it evolve in a sensible manner. So when we learn new stuff, we put it in. That's how the process works. Hopefully it's a good process. Okay, so let's look at some of these classes of earthquakes. And they say there are many earthquakes are deep earthquakes, many earthquakes are in different parts of the country, or many earthquakes are subduction earthquakes, they're different parts of the world. Some are more applicable to Canadian scene than others. And so if we're looking at deep earthquakes, these are restricted to the West Coast, so say that narrow band underneath Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle, Olympia, Washington. And they don't occur in eastern Canada, they don't occur farther north on the West Coast, just where the subduction zone is in southwest British Columbia and northwest United States. They have been the most common kind of damaging earthquake in the last century. And fortunately for Canada, all the damaging ones have been just inside the United States. So Washington State, Puget Sound region has had 4 damaging earthquakes, 1939, 1946, 1949, 1965, and 2001. That's 5, excuse me. 5 damaging earthquakes. So looking at what happened in Seattle, which is a magnitude 6.8, that's about as big as these guys get because the plate is pretty thin, might get a little bit bigger, but that's generally the size. But again, they're 50 or 60 kilometers away from the surface. So it's just like having it up at the surface and being 50, 60 kilometers away. The shaking has gone down because it's spreading out. The damage, this is a number I picked off the internet. I think it comes from the Washington State, 3.5 billion. I have no idea what the insurable damage is in there, but that's the number that they came up with. There was a lot of minor damage around, broken chimneys and things which would have been claimed if they met the insurance criteria. But a lot of infrastructure damaged, old stuff. One difference between Seattle and Vancouver and Victoria, and 9 more places in Canada, is that Seattle has been exposed to 5-ish earthquakes. Victoria and Vancouver, since they started being built in the 1850s, have not been exposed to any damaging earthquake. So we have a lot of still old vulnerable buildings that were fixed up by virtue of being damaged or knocked down by the previous earthquakes in Washington state. So that's the one problem. You can certainly look and see the kinds of things that happened in this earthquake, but realizing it might be a bit more because there's a lot of buildings that haven't been exposed to strong shaking. Some typical damage from pictures of the Seattle Times: unreinforced masonry, always a problem. When it's retrofitted, it does very well, but if it hasn't been retrofitted or not built properly, this is, concrete block building, probably built, who knows, 50s or 60s. This is an older building. You can see the roof parts coming down into the street. Lots of small landslides and slumps, few taking out houses, but mostly taking out infrastructure in terms of roads and water lines and things like that. A bit of liquefaction down the south end of Puyallup. Again, this is simply liquefaction and what we call lateral sliding. It liquefies underneath and the roads slid out to the sides a ways. And so it costs money to fix all those kinds of things. And that was the estimate on there. So these kinds of earthquakes, very few deaths, very few injuries. The total damage adds up to a lot. It's inconvenience to a lot of people when roads get put out of business or overpasses. There was several older overpasses that were damaged but didn't collapse that had to be replaced, so the traffic pattern changed and having that economic impact. Society can certainly cope with these kinds of things, I think, and the Seattle one wants to see what might happen in Vancouver or Victoria. They're looking at what happened to Seattle, looking at the damage patterns, very typical. So we have good examples for that kind of earthquake. The monster earthquakes, the great subduction earthquakes, like the last one we had in the year 1700. It has the most widespread shaking damage because they're huge in dimension and they release a lot of energy, and they always come with a tsunami. Sure you're all aware there was a big one in 2011 in Tokyo, in Japan generally, just off the coast of Sendai. That's not a very good example for what could happen in Canada. The Cascadia subduction zone, I showed you where the ridge is that's creating the only goes 200 kilometers sideways before it starts to go down. That's very hot, thin crust, and you can only build up so much energy in hot, thin crust. Northern Japan, on the other hand, not southern Japan, but northern Japan, where that big Tohoku earthquake occurred, is the oldest, coldest subduction zone in the world. So its depth goes way down deep and has a lot of width, whereas Cascadia is a long, skinny one with not much width. The area, which relates to the magnitude, adds up to similar large numbers, magnitude 9 or so, but in Japan, it's much shorter and much deeper. And so you can store up a lot more energy in one place for a long period of time because it has more width, and therefore you can cause a larger tsunami. And so looking at the kinds of things that happened there, it's not the best example to compare to Cascadia. And that's one of the things, particularly in the emergency management community, are, whoa, look at that tsunami. Whoa, look what, and I know let's calm it down and look for some more reasonable comparisons. And there is a good one, the one that occurred in Chile, not a small earthquake, magnitude 8.8 in 2010. Chile building codes, very similar to Canadian codes. They follow the US code very closely.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, so you're finding that the risk assessment in the emergency management community is less than perhaps it ought to be?
Well, I really don't want to comment on our risk assessment as opposed to the impressions of people.
Yeah.
They saw all this stuff on the TVs and they think, oh my God, we got to do something because that could happen here. Well, similar things, but not that. That's pretty extreme.
No, it's just you're absolutely correct on that, because I am in with that community, and they will use the Japanese earthquake as a direct analog.
Yeah. So there's a lot to learn from that earthquake, but it's not a good direct analog. Yeah. This is a much better one. What happened in Chile, the deaths, the damage ratio to the population, the damage ratio is much more applicable. Chile has a lot of poor people, so they have things that we don't have, like a lot of adobe structure. But it's a modern society. There are more high-rises in the big cities of Chile than there are on the west coast of Canada. Lots of sophisticated infrastructure, and largely following the U.S. code, right? So very similar types of construction. The damage patterns will be very similar. So what happened, right? About $40 billion worth of damage for about 500 kilometers of coastline of strong shaking, and a little closer than it can be in Canada because it's a bit older subduction zone than we have on the west coast of Canada. 562 deaths, most of those tsunami related. The second largest thing is adobe structures collapsing on people, and some modern structures damaged, but not that many. Several minutes of strong shaking. It takes a while for this rupture to proceed for hundreds of kilometers. It goes about 3 kilometers a second. So when you have 1,000 kilometers like you do in Cascadia, that's several minutes, right? When it's rupturing down at one end, the people at the other end can't feel it because it's so far away, even though it's the same earthquake. And that's almost the case in Chile, at 500 kilometers in length. So it takes physically a long time for it to rupture. So the shaking goes on for several minutes. And you get a significant tsunami accompanying these big subduction earthquakes. And again, we have these on the west coast and have had them on the west coast and can see deposits that were caused by them in the past. So let's just have a look at it. In Chile, there's 2 big cities that were exposed to it, Santiago and Concepcion. Concepcion, the equivalent on the west coast would be along the coast. This rupture extends somewhat inland because the plate age over here is a little bit older, therefore it's a little bit cooler, therefore it's a little bit thicker, so it means the rupture can actually go down. These colors here, going from red, which is where the epicenter and the largest pile of rupture is, a secondary center of rupture here, green down to white. The aftershocks outline the total area of rupture, which is approximately that box, but the strongest shaking was right here. So Concepcion got very strong shaking, but again, remember, this is not at the surface. It's down 25 or 30 kilometers. So we're already 25 or 30 kilometers away from the strongest shaking. Okay, I think those are the main things I want to see. So we have a good example of what happened to structures and modern structures in Santiago, which is kind of more typical of what would happen in Vancouver, Victoria, because it's some distance from the shaking. And Concepcion, maybe even more severe than what we could get. But there was, in all of that, one high-rise to collapse. Now, you saw this picture over and over again from different angles on the days following the earthquake, and you thought, oh my God, this place is a mess. There was only one high-rise. Now, many had to be torn down because they're damaged. And that's building codes in Chile, in Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Japan. They're all life safety codes. They are not no damage code. So if something is built to the building code, it's meant not to collapse, not to have no damage. So after the earthquake, you may have to tear down some of these buildings or have expensive retrofits. And that's something that's not generally realized in society, thinking, oh yeah, we've got a building code, no sweat. But if it didn't collapse, which, except for one case in Chile, it succeeded according to the building code. That's something to keep in mind. You can still have a significant damage. So there was a number of large buildings that were tilted or partial damage to them that had to be torn down in many cases or very expensively retrofitted. In some cases, not so expensively. You know, they can do amazing things if the building's basic guts is not damaged. Big impact on the society was the loss of infrastructure. Here's a bridge, rather an older one. You can see by this kind of construction underneath here. Was an arch bridge that collapsed going across this, cut that highway out. More significant in terms of modern structure are overpasses going along the highway. They lost a lot of these overpasses. A basic design flaw where these things just fall off the ledge that they were sitting on and not attached properly. In particular, they found most of the ones that were going perpendicular across the highway survived, whereas most of the ones that were at an angle twisted and fell off. So that plugged up this highway, plugged up that highway, and took a lot of the communications and various other things, power that would have been in these tubes, right? So that had a huge impact on Chile, and that's typical of all earthquakes, but, you know, the shaking impacts the infrastructure, which then impacts people and businesses, which can't carry on normally. But quite a few things learned about highway design, hopefully around the world from this. And, with small wood frame structures, this happens to be one a colleague of mine took when he was down there, performed very well. This is right near top of the strongest shaking, right? Which again, is 25 kilometers really away because the earthquake is down on the ground. So, that performed very well. And then there was tsunami damage, as you always get stuff swept up. I mean, what used to be nice little rows of houses are piles of junk. And you've seen that on your television screens from Tohoku and this earthquake as well. But looking at an example from that earthquake, that's a better analogy than the Tohoku one because it's a younger subduction zone. So comments, the damage is very widespread. It's because it's 500 kilometers of rupture and 150 kilometers deep of rupture. It shakes that whole area and areas beyond that. The damage is not like being close to a very near surface earthquake because the shaking is not as strong because it's down in the earth. There, the public tsunami earthquake education worked very well. It was in the middle of the night in the dark. Almost everybody knew because they'd had a big earthquake and tsunami in Chile in 1960, even bigger than this, the largest earthquake in the world that we know about. That was in the memory of the general public. So when the shaking happened in the middle of the night, everybody had been educated. You get the heck out of there, right? And they did. And so there were remarkably few deaths compared to the number of villages that got wiped out by fishing villages that got wiped out by the tsunami. Still, the biggest death toll came from tsunamis, and the biggest single death toll was on a little island in the middle of the river that had one little small, it was a long weekend, like our Labor Day weekend, and there was all kinds of people camping on this island, and right at the mouth of a river, and they couldn't get off in the middle of the night. It was one little ferry that took a few people across, and, they didn't have a chance. And so that's where the biggest chunk of deaths occurred from the tsunami. Unreinforced masonry is a problem. It's always a problem. And especially there, adobe construction, which we don't have elsewhere, but a lot collapsed and killed our people. Again, retrofitted unreinforced masonry did very well, where somebody had gone in, a building had already been built, an engineer looked at it and said, this is how we strengthen the building, mainly by attaching the roof to the walls, and the ceiling and the floors to the walls very strongly. It's the main retrofit, and that really made a difference. The earthquake science understanding was very good. The shaking that happened was exactly what it was expected. It was exactly what was in the building code. The buildings performed as they were supposed to. They didn't collapse, except for one. But a lot of them got damaged because that's the way building codes work. Building codes work. And the internet, interesting enough, survived very well. I was getting stuff from Chile minutes after that. And, a lot of lines were taken out by the nature of the design of the internet. It's always looking for the most efficient path. And so this path has jumped down, that one is. So, let's stop there at the end.
Quick question of the group. Gary and I were talking about this element earlier. Anybody offer an opinion? If somebody has earthquake insurance for their business, is tsunami covered? And if somebody has earthquake insurance for their home, is tsunami covered?
That's certainly not in the Caribbean.
Well, on the industrial side, because I've been having some of these discussions, there's no pat answer. Sometimes tsunami is covered under the flood section, and sometimes it's specifically covered under the earthquake section. So read the contract.
Mm-hmm. Read the contract. That's interesting.
Yep. And on the homeowner side, more likely earthquake would exclude tsunami because it's a flood exclude.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I see some nodding, but again, not everybody.
Yeah, I think typically flood and earthquake insurance are totally separated within the insurance sector.
If I remember correctly, flood is excluded, so anything to do with in Canada anyway, so that's gone because it's surface flood. And earthquake is a separate coverage. So you might be able to get it under earthquake, but I doubt it.
You have to buy it as a separate product.
Is the product there to buy?
For earthquake, yes.
But for tsunami, and would it be covered? That's kind of the question. Anyway, read the contract. I guess that's
yeah, but it's in personal lines. It's a little different because in commercial you actually can get flood coverage under some circumstances. In personal lines, you can't. So you may be stuck.
Okay, let's move on to the next category, which is the shallow earthquakes. And these are the most damaging type of earthquake because very strong shaking can occur close to the source. I don't know if this is right, but I strongly suspect it. So the most damaging earthquake in Japan has, from an earthquake shaking point of view, is still the Kobe earthquake, I believe. Because the earthquake went right through the middle of the city, right under the city. Extremely strong shaking. The big subduction earthquake that just happened, I've been trying to extract from all the stuff, the earthquake damage. And, it's dominated by that when you go over the literature, the tsunami damage. But my impression of what I can find of earthquake damage is mostly old, unreinforced masonry buildings that had some damage. And certainly most modern construction survived extremely well. But I don't have a figure for earthquake damage there. So my strong suspect, almost positive, that the Kobe will be hugely bigger than the earthquake damage from this magnitude 9 earthquake, right? The Kobe was only 6.8 or 9, depending how you count it. Some people count it as 7, but a much smaller earthquake, but right close to the surface and right under the city of Kobe. So these kinds of shallow earthquakes can occur anywhere in Canada. And the most recent good example is Christchurch. Now, it's not totally applicable, but a lot of things that happened in Christchurch, you can take home to Canada and say, that could happen here. If you had an earthquake that close to your city or your piece of infrastructure. So the Christchurch earthquake, magnitude 6.1, not a huge earthquake, but clearly you'll see enough ability to do damage. It was 12:51, lunchtime, sunny day, summer, tourist city, all kinds of people sitting outside on sidewalks that you see all over Ontario here in these nice little villages I've been touring the last few days before I came here. 10 seconds of very strong shaking because you're so close to the source. And with the actual source of shakings within 5 kilometers of downtown, and although it doesn't appear to rupture the surface, it's probably within a kilometer or so, kilometer or two of the surface. About $20 billion worth of damage, 182 people killed. Population, it's a very good analogy. I've been using this in talks in Victoria because it's about the same size. It's a tourist city. They both call themselves City of Gardens. And very similar, New Zealand codes are very similar to Canadian codes. How many people here have been to Christchurch? One, okay. This is Christchurch city. There's a huge park here. Probably about a kilometer or so in dimension. Almost a kilometer in this dimension. The main city is here, which is called CBD. I'll refer to that a couple times, Central Business District. So within the Central Business District, there are about 6,000 companies, about 50,000 employees, and 25% of the employment of the city is in this small area just here. The earthquake is just off the south of this map and extremely close. This is about a kilometer in dimension here. And this is the river wandering through Christchurch. This is the Central Business District, just to show you where most of the concentration of those numbers are that are there. So 350,000, lots of cities in Ontario that size of Victoria, lots of cities in the east of that size. So right after the earthquake, this is now the same picture with the park there, this area was cordoned off. And how many have been to Victoria? More than half of you. This is Victoria. So this is the inner harbor of Victoria. There's the Empress Hotel, the Parliament buildings, the Empress Hotel, and basically downtown core at the same scale as that. So this area was cordoned off right after the earthquake with soldiers, with weapons, and a big fence standing around there. And you could not go in there. Your business was in there, your home was in there, your car was in there, your motorcycle, tough luck. You could not go in there. I went up there. Can I just go in a little bit to take a picture of this building? No, sir, you cannot go in there. I'm not going to do anything. No, sir, you cannot. These guys had instructions, and nobody was getting in there for a very, very long period of time.
When I went, you could see the papers on the ground, the chairs tipped over,
yeah.
And just no one had been in there.
Yeah. So, I actually got permission to go in there, but I was managed to touch the right people to get inside. So if you put that on top of Victoria, it's the whole downtown area of Victoria, or the whole downtown area of any kind of city that has that kind of population. It's kind of huge. And you can see this cordon, I mean, gradually, a year later, it was still that big, which is, putting relations to Victoria, the main part of downtown Victoria. April of this year, over 2 years later, it was big as the blue area, again putting on Victoria, a significant part of the downtown, and it was finally lifted June 28th of this year, 2.5 years. And, you know, what they were concerned about is big high-rise buildings. Again, they didn't collapse, but they were afraid they might collapse in an aftershock and squash the buildings on the side. So you might have had some little business that was there, and you've been very diligent, even if it was unreinforced masonry, you'd have it retrofitted, and it was perfectly fine, and all your stuff was in there, and there's no way you could get at it. Yeah.
Were these boundaries, in your opinion, justified, or how were they set?
Yeah, they were set immediately by virtue of the damage that was seen in kind of the first 24, 48 hours.
But was it set by panicked politicians, or were they receiving good advice?
Set by emergency officials. One of the things that they had a big advantage in this earthquake is that it occurred in February. In September of the previous year, they had an earthquake magnitude 7, much bigger, 25 kilometers out of town. When you're 25 kilometers from an earthquake, no well-built building is going to have any serious damage. But unreinforced masonry, again, is vulnerable, right? And so that earthquake occurred in the middle of the night. They had some damage and closed off streets, damaged some infrastructure, lots of problems. They had a practice earthquake. So they brought people in, they did things, they closed off streets, they had miles of fencing there. They had, you know, they got their act together. They have their act together very well because they seem to have more natural hazards than we do in Canada as a whole, concentrated in one small place. So when this earthquake happened, it just so happened the New Zealand military was training with, I think it was it's a foreign country, I think it was Singapore military, I might be wrong, but there were two militaries training in the immediate area. They were immediately available. They still had all this fencing left over from the previous one. They had not put it away. Within 24 or 48 hours, it was the emergency officials who had set up their structure and learned during the last earthquake who called the shots. This area is out, and immediately they got engineers. Could this be vulnerable? What do we need to do? They made the decisions. They told the military officers. The officers told their guys, and nobody was getting in there.
So even in hindsight, the reactions.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So, and then as they learned more, this cordon shrunk, as I can show you, and it even shrunk in the first week or two, right? But not much change in the first. Well, not much change in the first week or two, the first month or two. By the time I left there, happened to be there. I was there for another meeting, a tsunami meeting, and 3 days before I was due to leave, this earthquake happened. So I was already there. So I went to we had a tsunami meeting for a week, and then I went down to this area. So I managed to get inside because of my emergency contacts. And I guess just as I was about to leave, the first business owners were being allowed in for, I think, 5 minutes or 10 minutes, I can't remember which, into their building to grab stuff. And they had pictures on the TV. People were going in, grabbing computers and coming out. And outside there was an emergency official and several policemen with whistles, and if they blew them, they had to come out if there was an aftershock or if they exceeded their time. Yeah?
So one thing that concerns me now with the comments you just made,
yeah.
Well, you don't know my background, but I've been working with the RMS and the
yep.
QE and the air
yep.
models for probably about 15 years.
Yeah.
And I run lots of them. And the results you get out of any of those models, I've never seen damage projections that even come close to a full year.
Mm-hmm.
Ever, not once.
Yeah.
And you're saying 2.5 years interruption is, even in hindsight, was an appropriate response.
Yeah, so business interruption can be significant, and that's really the point of it. And RMS people were down there the same time as I was. They didn't get inside, but I mean, they drove around the edge, and you could see almost all you had to see from around the edge.
None of their models in any of the portfolios I've run are any buildings.
So
anything close,
yeah.
Never even approached.
I say there may have been buildings that were absolutely fine. In fact, there were lots of buildings that are absolutely fine, right? About 25% of the buildings, when you drive through that cordoned-off area, had visible damage, right? The other 75% look fine. And they may have damage inside, but people couldn't get at it. And there was something like, I think, we did the back-of-the-envelope calculation, figured somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 cars were trapped in there, including most of the rental cars. Again, people couldn't get at them. You know, as we were wandering around, there were cars everywhere. You know, not damaged. You just couldn't get in to get your car out. Yeah.
And from a business continuity point of view, that would mean unless you had your data backed up elsewhere, you have no access to data, and for anything like paper data, you have no access to it, period.
Yeah.
Also for your, if you're doing some sort of alternative site work, that alternative site had better be available in many cases for 2.5 years. So it's not just a case of, oh, it's, you know, we've cut off for a week or so, everyone work from home. You know, you're going to really have to be doing an alternative site.
Yeah, and exactly. And the point I'm making is, even if you've taken all the steps to be diligent, your building was perfectly fine, nothing happened to your building, you tied down all your computers, you may have been interrupted for a very, very long period of time because you live next to a high-rise that had some damage and might follow.
Your only advantage is you can go home eventually.
Eventually, yeah. And so, I say, finally it is lifted, everybody can go home, everybody can drive on those streets now, but it took a long time, right? So that's I think something that needs to be passed on is that, you know, business continuity insurance and business continuity planning is exceedingly important.
So your backup site better be at least 1 kilometer away.
I mean, not like in 9/11 where they had it in...
Now, if your city experiences a bigger earthquake, that area is going to be bigger. So the 1 kilometer rule of thumb may not be so good, right? You may want to be in the next city. You know, backup for our stuff is in Ottawa. We have in 2 places, and backup for some of the emergency planning things in British Columbia are in Kelowna, right? I mean, that hundreds of kilometers away, just to make sure. Anyway, those are individual business decisions, but people should know about this, and insurance industry should know about this, because that's what you need to tell people who are selling people insurance. Okay, I think I made that point to death. So here's just a few pictures of this. This is a remarkable picture. Tourists sitting on the Port Hills, which is just south of Christchurch, and you can see the downtown area, and you see all that. And what that is dust from collapsing buildings. That's taken within a minute of the earthquake. Just dust going up in the air. And one of the things I managed to do was score a helicopter ride over the city. And there's the city. I mean, a quick look, you don't see anything there, do you? I mean, you have to start looking. If you start looking carefully, you'll start to see stuff, right? And let's just zoom in on one area, right? So that's just one area there, and, you know, say, well, that building's toast. This building is, roof's rotated, that's toast. That building has a real serious problem. You can see the corner of that building's gone. This building is, you know, damage on the front of that building. So they're not all flat, but they're not habitable or useful, right? And you kind of see that as you flew over the city. But again, I'd say just driving through, my guess would be 25% of the buildings had visible, strong shaking damage. 75% looked fine. They may have had some damage. There's the iconic, that's after the first earthquake, 2 serious aftershocks just really wiped out that place. That was the big cathedral that was in the central square of Christchurch. It was the iconic Christchurch. You stood in that square. And all kinds of neat old buildings built in the late 1800s like that. You know, another unreinforced masonry building. You can see it here, toast, right? These are things I've grabbed off the internet. Some of these pictures I've taken myself, not that one. Typical unreinforced building. In this case, the whole front side is just collapsed into the street. And in this case, there was a car there. Very close to where I was staying, which was just, I showed you that big park, just the other side of the park, so a kilometer or 2 away. Most of the neighborhood had no visible damage, but all the damage is in old buildings like this. There was a small store, probably built, you know, around the turn of the century, was unreinforced masonry. 2 stories like this fell onto a car like that and killed 2 people, right? But most of the neighborhood was fine. Hotel we stayed in, there was a little crack up the wall.
So just to clarify, damage like this picture,
Yeah.
would damage like this have occurred outside of the cordoned off area?
This would have been inside, yeah. This is inside. I grabbed this one off the internet, but that would have been inside. So, I mean, there's a more modern brick building
I
that,
think you were saying, Gary,
Yeah.
unreinforced masonry, you could have had damage to unreinforced.
that's right, you could, outside, yeah. So the one I'm talking about was the neighborhood where I was
But a
staying.
well-built building outside.
Yeah, well-built buildings in that region, typical buildings, right, which are well-built in New Zealand and well-built in Canada, suffered minimal damage. But in that pocket of well-built buildings, like 2 blocks away, there was, you know, a building like that the front had caved in, right? Only one. All the rest are fine. Chimneys are fine, storefronts are fine, but this one building, it just shows you how vulnerable unreinforced masonry can be, particularly old unreinforced masonry, where the mortar between the bricks is getting to be 100 years old and not quite so strong, and maybe not made to the same mortar standards as we did today. So unreinforced masonry can occur. Say the initial earthquake that occurred in September was 25 kilometers away, a bit bigger earthquake, but did a lot of unreinforced damage in the city of Christchurch. And once you're 25 kilometers away from most well-built buildings will survive with very minor damage. But unreinforced masonry are not well-built buildings in terms of earthquake resistance, particularly old ones, right? But you can retrofit things like this. And there's a modern building, not an old one, right beside it. It's unreinforced masonry or reinforced according to the code. I don't know exactly what it is, and it seems to be fine, right? So it's spotty, and it picks out the weak buildings. There is a picture taken by one of the people who's working around it. This is inside the cordon. Exactly, this is just out. That fencing there went all around. So this is just inside. You can see a lot of damage, and this type of architecture with this kind of sandstone structure was very common around Christchurch. It was a mark of Christchurch. That building is toast. It's an old church. However, here's a building of the same vintage that has been retrofitted. Again, there's the cordon. That's what the cordon looked like. Soldiers patrolling along here, gates. No visible damage on the outside. I don't know what's on the inside, but very same neighborhood. You can see a crane has lifted the turret. It used to belong up here, so there probably was some damage to the turret. Looked like it might have fallen off, so I guess they just lifted it off and are going to fix it. But unreinforced, retrofitted masonry survive very well.
I think those two are very powerful pictures because I know sometimes even historical groups will say, don't touch this building, it's historical, it's old, just grandfather it along, and for various reasons you'll have people wanting to grandfather building codes and not want to put the retrofit in for either for historical reasons or financial reasons. But with something like this, you can say, if you do that, you are sure to lose the building eventually, and we can retrofit it in such a way that it does not materially affect, or at least affect the visibility and the sort of historicity of the building.
One of the lectures I've been giving is with a professor at UBC who was down there, Dr. Ken Elwood. He was down there at the time of the earthquake at a conference. And so we've been giving a couple lectures to the historical societies. And what Ken was saying, after talking to the engineers down there, is what you need to do if you are concerned with historical buildings and value them, is first of all, make an inventory of them. And how important are they to society? Maybe you can't afford to fix up everyone, but pick the key ones, right? So everybody knows what they are. Secondly, have the plans of those buildings available, not in the building, but somewhere else, so that when an engineer coming around having to assess the building or an emergency official saying, that's vulnerable, tear it down, he's got some idea what's inside and saying, well, that building could be fixed because it's got a very strong shear wall in the center and we could just we can fix that. So those two key things, have an inventory and an assessment of how important your heritage buildings are to your society, and make sure that's well known, and make sure it's on a list of things that are going to get retrofitted. Whether you can afford it instantly or not, over maybe the next 50 years, you can retrofit those suckers, and have the plans available so that somebody having to make an instant call after, they lost a lot of heritage buildings in New Zealand, many of them unnecessary, if that had been available. If the people making the call realized that they were important. But people had to make instant decisions. They were inside the cordon. Is that safe? Is that not safe? Is that threatening the building next to it? Tear them down because they're life safety. Anyway, a lot of high rises, about 40 high rises buildings, which is, I think, a significant number, maybe even close to the majority, and can have some serious structural problems. And this happens to be an old one, but you can certainly see, I just like that photograph, I think that's Ken Elwood's photograph, of the shear cracks as the building rocked back and forth. So that one has a really serious problem that you can see. There were two collapses of high-rise buildings, both kind of from the same thing. They were eccentric. If you build a building like this, and the way people used to design buildings were, you have a building like this that's very strong, it would shake well in this direction, you design it, you shake it in this direction, and that should cover it. But what often happened, not often, but sometimes, is you'd put a giant elevator tower on this side, which is very strong. like that. And then the building, instead of shaking this direction or that direction, it starts going around that strong thing. And nobody's thought about the torsional modes or hasn't designed the pillars to be as strong. And that killed the two buildings that collapsed, one built in the 60s and one built in the 80s. They really shouldn't have collapsed, but they did. But you know, torsional modes are, most building codes have those taken care of. And so an engineer designing a building today or for the last decades would, a few decades, would take that into account. Most of the wood frame structures were not, but this was an old heritage house, and you can see clearly they built the first floor, and then the second floor there's no strength across the two floors, and it went there. That's one of the few wood frame buildings I saw that was damaged, but it was right in the area of the strongest shaking. You can't see any damage here. You can see cranes starting to tear down buildings, and you can't see but the police building is seen in here. And I put that in because the police building was built extra strong because it was a post-disaster building. No structural damage that know about that building, but it was unoccupied because it had asbestos in the insulation, and the flexing caused asbestos dust through the whole building, so it was abandoned until they cleaned it up. So all their communications and everything, all had to be instant backup communications, even though the building was totally sound, right, structurally. So structure is not always your problem. Liquefaction and differential settlement caused a lot of problem because of rather unique situations there. So there's lots of good examples of what in Christchurch of what can happen when liquefaction happens very near the surface. What is liquefaction? Well, that's when you have usually sand. In order to liquefy, you have to have a clean, geological clean sand. What that means is all little particles are about the same size. So as the process that creates the liquefaction, creates the sand deposit, you know, and the particles are not perfectly round. They're kind of, if you shake that, it will densify, whether it's got water in it or not. If it's water saturated and you shake that, it will densify. So the particles will pack themselves in a more dense vacuum. And it will squeeze the water out because the rocks are heavy. And as that water tries to go to the surface, it pushes apart all the little sand above it, and so they aren't touching one another, and it loses strength. So any building that's heavy, all of a sudden, it's not being supported, and it could sink. And any pilings that are buoyant will pop up because they're no longer being grabbed by. But if the material is all mixed up in different sizes, it fills in all those little holes. And so in a typical river deposit, you don't get liquefaction. But there are unique things that create liquefaction. One is beaches. You go down to the beach, you walk it feels nice on your feet because all of the particles are about the same size. And a beach environment creates a certain size of particle depending on the energy of that beach and the kind of rock that's been beaten up. So old beaches are very good examples. And when the glaciers, 10,000, 20,000 years ago, depending where we were in the earth, were laid down, they had sucked up all the water and sea level was much lower. So as sea level encroached, there were places where the beaches just migrated and kept depositing a nice beach deposit. This is one of the examples in Christchurch. So along where the river is, there's these continual deposits very near the surface of liquefiable material, and that caused a lot of problems. We don't have environments exactly like that. Everybody will say, oh, well, we know that the Fraser River south of Vancouver is a big river and it must have problems. Well, yes, it does, but what happens there is that the river is coming down with its mixed load, very muddy river if you look into it, which means the particles are all different sizes. And generally what's being deposited on the Fraser River Delta is very mixed up stuff that does not liquefy easily. But as the river comes down, the tide comes up, and the river virtually stops for at high tide, and the tide goes down, it goes again. So every time it stops, it precipitates out a certain size of particle. So you get these nice little lenses of one size of particle built at the bottom of river channels. And then there's a big flood, and the river decides to go this way, and goes that way for a long time, and there's another big flood until man came along and started damming the river. So what you have under the Fraser Valley is all little lenses scattered throughout the area at different depths that are liquefiable material. And you know, most of the structure that's been built in Richmond for the last, certainly since the 1970s, they've been aware of this problem. And liquefaction is a geotechnical engineering problem that can be solved. You either densify the material before it can densify itself under shaking by a number of techniques, or you dig it out and get rid of it and put something else there. So if you know about it, you can deal with it. And to say much of Richmond, certainly major structures have been delta. And also even in small structures, which I'm going to show you, is could well be addressed in a building code. Many of the small structures that were built there were built on slab foundations, and the slab was just poured pile of concrete on the ground, no reinforcing in it at all. So if liquefaction happened near it or under it, it would tilt and distort. If it was that same thing, it might have tilted and distorted, but you could have jacked it back up. And so it perhaps could be addressed with a building code, but the kinds of slabs that they poured there did not react well to liquefaction, and that caused them big problems. But here are two large buildings built on probably piles because they're in the river area, and they're both tilted, not a huge amount, but you like your buildings to be straight up and down. And so what do you do to these? I mean, should you leave them? Should they be fixed? Can you jack them up and fix the piles under them, even though the building's already there? These are the kinds of questions the engineers are addressing underneath that. And liquefaction happened to be where your car was. Tough luck, right? And there is a massive amount of ejecta coming up of sand material, quite fine sand material. And this is just going down the street. That's how deep it was in that particular area. Foot deep, I guess, of stuff flooding that street. And here's liquefaction again, and this is along the river, and again, the layer is near the surface, and so that's what we call lateral spreading, where it's just slid out towards the river because a layer very close to the surface has liquefied and just no strength, and so it goes towards the free surface, which is the river, and slid to the side. So damage along the river like that was very common. There's a house that's had, again, probably lateral sliding towards the river, which is some distance away, but big crack going. Some of these cracks are going to people's houses, right, and killing this foundation. And, in some cases, there's a little bit of, I had a helicopter right over, and you could see, as you're flying around, every open area, playing field, whatever, were full of these sand volcanoes where the material is coming up. And so that the same thing that's going on there is going on in the neighborhoods. And so a lot of houses, when you drove through that area, there was virtually no visible damage of shaking. But because of liquefaction, a lot of the houses, in fact, there's whole neighborhoods which they just say it's not worth rebuilding again. Mainly, not so much the houses, but all the infrastructure. The sewage with no water and the telephone lines and everything. They were so proud that they had all of their facilities built under, there's no telephone poles with wires going. Everything was underground in Christchurch because it was easy to dig. But retrospectively, that was not a good idea because it's very expensive to fix. I mean, water is obvious. If it's broken, it leaks over here. Sewage is not quite so obvious, and electricity is obvious. These buildings work, they don't. So a lot of problems there, and rather unique to that area because the liquefaction is over a wide area, very near the surface. A lot of building contents damage. The structure's fine, but I just took this through the window of the building. Just all the false ceilings coming down, and stock damage. This is called nice, beautiful New Zealand wine. A lot of the bottles survived, but a lot of it didn't. It makes your heart cry. And the stuff, what to do with all this? I just took this building when I walked. This is inside the cordoned area of a building that they've just pushed all the junk to the building collapsed together. Again, you can see it's an unreinforced building with somewhat of a concrete wall there, but most of what you can see there is brick. But a giant pile of junk, huge amounts of junk. So these are just some random comments on here. The damage was serious, but it was very localized. Magnitude 6 earthquake only damaged serious structure, within 10 kilometers or so, and then, more vulnerable structures on the outside. So very localized. Shaking exceeded the probabilistic design. So they had a 1 in 500 year design there. This is the 1 in 20,000 year earthquake. So because you have a 1 in 500 year design, can you have bigger? Yes, you can. Here's an example, right? It can happen. So this shaking vastly exceeded the design criteria in the building code for all of those modern buildings built according to the New Zealand building code. And that can happen anywhere, including Canada. You can have bigger earthquakes. Things, both in the insurance industry, the kinds of things that come from RMS and their competitors are probabilistic based. And the building code is probabilistic based. So it allows for stronger things to happen and gives a probability on that. But this is your 1 in 20,000 year earthquakes. They can see the layers have been laid down since the glacier, and this is the first time that it's ruptured up to the surface. And, you know, and the glaciation that year in that area was almost 20,000 years ago. So a rare event indeed, but, you know, a very serious one. Again, you know, unreinforced masonry was a big problem. Again, retrofitted unreinforced masonry did very well. Building codes work. Even though this vastly exceeded the design criteria for all of those buildings, there were 2 collapses, and one can say they probably shouldn't have collapsed because of the way they were built, but anyway, they did. But a lot of buildings had to be torn down, very expensive, but building codes are life safety codes, not no damage codes, yeah?
To make another point, if you were to run this model through RMS or AIR or any of those, assuming what you would get is a predicted 25% damage ratio, which probably,
Visibly,
and we would interpret that as, 25% damage, but what you're saying, you saw 25% of the buildings were damaged, so it's 25% of the buildings were 100% damaged, and the rest were probably okay. Right?
well, we don't know. I mean, I didn't see inside them, but I'm just saying visible damage was about that. But yeah, I mean, say, the RMS people were down there the same time as I was, and so they have all this information too. They didn't get inside the cordon, but you could see pretty much from outside, and, you know, many of these things I dragged off the internet. Near surface, and that's the emphasis on near surface liquefaction, can be very costly. Access to absolutely denied for weeks, and then kind of as months went on, a little bit more, but no businesses inside there were opening up, right? And again, the internet survived very well. I had shaking, strong shaking, you know, boom, an earthquake happens because it's on my computer. Oh, magnitude 6, gee, that's pretty close to Christchurch. Within less than half an hour, 2G, 2 times the force of gravity. They got a serious problem here, right? I mean, so that was coming over the internet, you know, from instruments inside Christchurch, right? And instantly, that information was available to the emergency planning community in New Zealand. So within half an hour, they knew they had a very serious problem all over New Zealand, all over the world, for people who can interpret those numbers, right? Some selected impacts, 182 deaths, most of them in those 2 collapsed high-rises, and in fact, most of them in one of the collapsed high-rises. 6,000 hospitalized injuries, over 6,000. 70% of their heritage structures gone, which is what the city was famous for and what attracted its tourist trade. Not all of those had to be bulldozed down if they'd done those kinds of things, right? Didn't think about it. That's a lesson for other cities that have heritage structures that they want to preserve. 50% of the downtown buildings to be or have been now demolished, right? So half of them gone. The close of the downtown core for 2.5 years, or parts of it anyway, up to 2.5 years. Over 7,000 homes to be demolished, neighborhoods eliminated. So all of those massive liquefied areas, in many cases, they've just decided, you know, even if the houses are good, they just don't, they want to get rid of those areas and make them parks along the river. Tough decision if you happen to live inside that area. 4.5 million tons of debris. Some of it contaminated stuff. You know, the plans and where do you put all this stuff was a big thing there. I'll get to in a second. About 9,000 people, I put this together from the Seismological Society, so that was in April. 9,000 people have gone from a population of 350,000, 370,000. Will they come back? Who knows? And about $20 billion, that's 10% of the GDP of New Zealand. Significant. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah. Do you know if there were any hospitals or anything within the cordon?
Yes, there was. The main hospital was there. It had, you know, extra design, as in Canada, because it's supposed to emergency, like the police building. Absolutely fine. It was running the next day. And it's right in the area with collapsed buildings around it. So you can build stuff.
They were able to access it even if it was in the cordon area.
And off the streets, and it was working. And I think there were 2 hospitals, but the one main one, in fact, I might even have that picture. Anyway, we'll go back to that. But anyway, so the answer is, in Canada and most countries, post-disaster buildings are required to be built stronger. So they're effectively for a lower probability. And that hospital was absolutely fine. In fact, one of the ways it was just squeezed outside the cordon because it was fine. And so the line went down beside it. So I can remember walking by that to go around the cordon of the hospital. Okay, let's get to the last part of the talk, which is the Haida Gwaii earthquake, which occurred last year on October the 27th, so almost a year ago. Magnitude 7.7, not a small earthquake. It's the size of earthquake that occurred in Pakistan 10 days ago, killed several hundreds of people, decimated of buildings all over the place. But again, very poor construction, Pakistan, rural area in the mountains. There were no deaths and no injuries. They caused minimal damage because the closest approach of any population, anybody living, was 50 kilometers away, and a significant tsunami. There's Haida Gwaii, for those of you who don't know it. Where the roads are is where the population is on the east coast. There was the epicenter of the earthquake. The southern part of Haida Gwaii is a national park reserve, essentially a national park jointly managed by the Haida Nation and Parks Canada. The rupture of the earthquake was almost the length of this, so no people living in there, and the closest population up here to the edge of the rupture about 50 kilometers away. About 4,000 people live on Haida Gwaii, mostly on the North Island, up here. And the only population, the airport's just on the north end of the South Island. So that's where the population is. 50 kilometers at least, or a couple hundred kilometers at the other end from the earthquake. There are the aftershocks in the first 2 months, the larger aftershocks, which outline the rupture area. So it was right here, essentially opposite the national park, where nobody lives. It's a peculiar kind of rupture. Remember right at the beginning I said the Queen Charlotte Fault was not a straight fault, it had a curve at the southern end. Well, what happens is that the complicated diagram, but I'll take you through it. The southern end, this is the motion between the two plates, yet that is the orientation of the coastline because of that curve. And so some of the motion goes into big, what we call strike slip earthquakes, like this, and some of the motion goes into thrust earthquakes, like a subduction earthquake. It's a very small subduction zone, with this rate being very low, and the rupture along the Queen Charlotte Fault that we can map on the ocean floor, big strike slip earthquakes like along the San Andreas Fault, and the largest earthquake in Canada was 1949, a magnitude 8.1 of this kind, but this earthquake was on this thrust. So in essence, it's like a subduction earthquake, so we can learn a lot from this particular earthquake about Vancouver Island and its vulnerability. So it's a rather unique situation in the world. There are a few other places that are like this, where you have both of those kinds of monster earthquakes. Anyway, that's where that earthquake was. It was a thrust earthquake, not a strike slip. There's the tsunami, and tsunamis are very directional. Most people don't realize that. They think of nice rings going out in the ocean. People often say, oh, it's like dropping a pebble in the ocean and it goes out. Well, it kind of is, but it's very focused. It's a line source. So the energy was focused offshore and onshore. And if you look at the tide gauges along Vancouver Island, they're actually larger in Oahu because of the focusing of this. So there was almost a meter on tide gauges, in some cases run up in various bays of 1.5 meters in Honolulu, and the largest we saw was about 0.5 meter to the north and to the south, but not on Haida Gwaii. It was quite big. The modeled wave from this modeling, which is using the earthquake displacement to do it, modeled wave on the outer shore was 2 to 3 meters. The run up, because there's lots of little inlets along the west coast there, where it gets squeezed, was about 7 meters. This is 2 meters, so 7 meters is way up there. The highest recorded is 13 meters, and the head of one inlet there. This is what the west coast of Haida Gwaii looks like. It's unpopulated. Unfortunately, a hurricane storm went through there a couple of days after the earthquake, and on the outer coast would have obliterated any tsunami deposits. So the only place they could measure it in little protected inlets up in behind. But, you know, it's a wild, rugged coast exposed to storms, and nobody lives there. Kinds of things, there's seaweed, as you can see, parked up in the trees. Logs moved around, ocean, typical beach debris into the forest. Measured the height. This happens to be in GPS, which is used for reference. Yeah, question?
Well, actually, on the southern tip of that island, I tried to get there once, I didn't, but there are some hot springs. And what I heard was that some of this earthquake, those hot springs dried up.
Yeah, that's right.
But what I haven't heard is if they've restarted yet. Do you know the
Sort
end
of.
of that story?
Sort of, I'll talk about it in a minute, let's just finish this. So, minimal damage because it's really low-rise wood frame structures, which are very earthquake resistant, and the closest one was 50 kilometers away. A few damaged channels, some cracks in walls, but that's virtually it. Scared the hell out of a lot of people, but no deaths, no injuries, and a significant tsunami. As I said, 7 meters in many places, and the maximum observed was 13 meters. Back to your question about hot springs. Hot Springs Islands are just down here, and indeed they did shut off. And they're not just hot springs and nice for tourists and paddlers to go and stop. They're a very significant part of the hydroculture. So they have cultural significance to them. They dried up. They have started seeping again down on the beach below the high tide level. So there is hot water coming out, but it's making its way to the surface in a different path. So the pools that people used to go and park in, and indeed they used to have ceremonies in terms of the hydroculture, are gone, at least for the moment. But some 2 months, 2.5 months, 3 months, I guess, after the earthquake, they started seeing seep between the high and low tide level, at low tide, of warm water. But there was a whole little ecosystem there that lived on these hot springs. You know, all those plants and animals are probably gone because they had this, 20-degree ground temperature all year round. Anyway, I think that's almost my last slide. Yeah, I was just going to end up with the building code. Basically, how we take all this knowledge and just put it in the building code, explain how we do it, just interact with companies that interact with insurance companies like RMS and EcoCat. We're working, it's just about finished, the 2015 building code, which will have some major changes in it. Not so much for the populated areas, but in areas where we know less about. As we learn more things, changes get bigger. Pretty consistent in the areas in the east and west, although some changes. And, again, this will proliferate throughout the science and throughout the consulting industry. And this is all, our map is often used as a baseline to compare other models, whether it's the RMS model, the EcoCat model, or somebody else's model, or somebody doing a specific study. So this is the end product of much of what we do in the Geological Survey of Canada, and calculated various probability levels. This happens to be small buildings, in other words, high frequency and a generalized hazard. But that's ultimately what we do, and that's ultimately our product, even though there's many stages that I'm involved with fully soon. And again, this year, as I was mentioning to Paul, we put out for the first time the first probabilistic hazard, tsunami hazard map of Canada. So tsunami hazard can be compared with earthquake hazard, can be compared with flood hazard, or any other hazard that's expressed in a probabilistic, and that can be downloaded free from the internet. Anyway, that's mainly what I had to say, and so if people have any questions on any part of it, or you want me to go back to a particular slide, I'd be happy to. Yeah, go ahead.
I wonder where the science of earthquake prediction stands.
A lot of people trying, billions of dollars spent, particularly in Japan and Russia. It's nowhere. It's a very, very tough problem. You're trying to deal with physics that you don't understand, that's way down in the ground, that you can't get to. And in general, I'm not optimistic that it's ever going to happen. In certain situations where you see repeated kinds of phenomena, it may well happen, right? Something happens, earthquake happens, wonder if that was related, something happens again, earthquake happens, aha, this somehow is, when this happens again, perhaps the earthquake will happen again. But there are many phenomena that are seen before earthquakes, but they're not seen everywhere, and they're not duplicated with earthquakes. So, it's a very tough problem, but it's nowhere. So don't count on that. Basically, we should build our infrastructure and buildings strong enough to withstand the earthquakes and not excite the population about the chance that we might predict earthquakes one day. That's not the approach. We need to make our buildings safe and our infrastructure robust so that we can survive earthquakes, or not long to fix it up. So yeah. No progress, but a lot of people working on the problem, and that could be a breakthrough, but I am not optimistic. Others are.
But, is there a correlation among earthquakes? If the pressure is released in one zone, does that mean it's more or less likely that there'll be a
Yeah,
subsequent earthquake?
earthquakes affect other earthquakes in two ways. One is if you have a significantly sized earthquake, it sends out a bunch of waves. And these waves are significant in terms of the ground. In big earthquakes, the ground will be going up and down, that kind of dimension. I mean, significant portions of a meter. That puts stress on the ground, and that can trigger other earthquakes. And we see good examples of this around the world. As these big surface waves pass through, earthquakes get triggered. Usually tiny earthquakes, but sometimes bigger earthquakes. So that's one way earthquakes, and that can happen. An earthquake on this side of the world can trigger an earthquake on that side of the world. And that's within, minutes or of the earthquake. And it happens right when these things pass through or shortly thereafter. The other way is when you have an earthquake, it changes the stress in the area immediately around that by a very minute amount. But if an earthquake in that vicinity is just ripe to go, it will go because it's just enough straw on the camel's back or whatever analogy to push it over the edge. And that's what aftershocks are. You have this main rupture and it's put additional stress on the area around the main rupture, and usually most of the aftershocks are in a halo around where the main rupture was. And that's exactly what's happening. The stress change, very minute, in that area is enough to push all those things over the edge. So yes, earthquakes can trigger other earthquakes, and it happens fairly frequently. But, one big earthquake on one side of the world, I mean, we have the one in Chile, people wanted to believe that triggered the Japan one, that's, I think, questionable, right? But and those we can demonstrate with lots of examples, big surface waves triggering other earthquakes, and in the immediate vicinity of an earthquake, sort of the next door neighbor earthquake triggering, sometimes quite big, sometimes even bigger than the initial one.
How do you define aftershock, and how can you tell something is an aftershock as opposed to a totally different event? Or
just by what I said. I mean, when you have an earthquake, is it a foreshock or is it a main event? There's almost always going to be aftershocks because it distorts the stress field in the immediate region.
Right, but there's the time factor. You can be years after the fact and still call it an aftershock.
That's right. It's an exponential decay. So there are lots of aftershocks right after the earthquake. They go down in both usually size and number and gradually get less and less. In the Haida Gwaii area, a year later, we're still getting about a dozen aftershocks a day. Most of them too small to be felt. There was one that was felt about 2 weeks ago. But, we've got displays of the seismographs up. You can see everything's kind of benign. Yukon's usually active, almost one earthquake a day up there. Get the mine blasts, so southern British Columbia is going off, but it isn't earthquakes, it's mine blasts. And then you look at the station we've got played out from Haida Gwaii, and there's about, a dozen earthquakes a day still going on. Days after the earthquake, it was almost black with, stuff, because there were hundreds of aftershocks per day.
I still don't understand, where does the aftershock end and the new event begin? How can you tell it's an aftershock and
It's muddy, you can't. I know insurance, you have to make some decisions sometime, and the sequence in Christchurch was, I won't call it unique, but very unusual, in that the aftershock sequence kept going on, and were these additional earthquakes really aftershocks, or were they additional main shocks? They were all within the stress area of the initial earthquake, so they're all related to the initial earthquake, so they probably could call them aftershocks, but they were earthquakes in their own right. So how you want to define that is very fuzzy, and most scientists will not make an adamant decision on that. But, most of the following earthquakes of the Christchurch earthquake were probably related to the first earthquake in September, which changed the stress field, which then caused the one that did all the damage in February, which then there was, I think, 3 other earthquakes big enough to do significant damage. And they were all a result of a change of the original stress field. So in that sense, you could call them aftershocks. They were related. But, were those, was the one that did all the damage its own earthquake? It was certainly not in the aftershock pattern of the initial earthquake. Different scientists would say different things, but they clearly were a result of his question there. Can you trigger earthquakes? Yes, you can, and it's because once you change something, it changes the stress field in the immediate area, and if something is vulnerable or ripe, it's going to happen.
There's been some actions in San Francisco and Washington State and elsewhere about retrofitting and moving past the idea that building codes will work on the next generation of buildings, but trying to impose regulatory action to deal with existing buildings. Do you have a sense that that might come to Canada a little bit more?
Again, where that's enforced, or where it's in Canada now, and indeed in the US, is at the municipal level. So you take Victoria, for instance. They are a lot of old buildings in the downtown core. Rules say that if you're going to change the use of a building, you have to bring it up to present code. Fire code, water, electricity, and earthquake code. In some cases, this is just not practical. That building is going to stay vacant forever. So Victoria City Council has been very creative. They're saying, okay, come back with a reasonable plan, right? And usually the vulnerability in old buildings is not attaching the floors and the roof to the walls and making sure that the walls are strong if they're unreinforced masonry. But it's the attaching that's the detailing that's important. So, often they'll say, for this price, we could bring it up to the previous code or 75% of the code, and this will be its use, and the city will negotiate, depending. And a lot of the downtown core of Victoria, it's the problem that might have caused that building to collapse has now been eliminated. Maybe it'll still be damaged, but they've been negotiating. So that's the level at which it happened. It's not in the national code, building code. It's not in, as far as I'm aware, in any of the provincial codes. I don't even think it's yet in any state codes, although I'm not sure about California. But many cities are being creative because they have these old cores built, in the last part of the last century, around the turn of the century, and those buildings are vulnerable. So to get them, the strength being brought up to some sense, so that if the earthquake isn't right under them, but it's, like the first earthquake in New Zealand, 20 kilometers away, that everything will survive. So that's the way it's happening now. Whether it should be related, like the national code is not law. The national code is a model code that only becomes law when it's adopted by the provinces or by an individual city, right? In most cases, it's provinces. In some cases, there are individual city charters, like the City of Vancouver. And the City of Vancouver has been ahead of the curve all the way along, making earthquake restrictions and rules long before they got on the national scene, and often having them more restrictive. So that's how it's handled. So, our moves afoot to do things, I'm not sure, I'm not a politician, I'm not aware of any general political move, but at the individual level, that's what happens in the individual cities, and that's a good thing. So, because what you don't want is the kind of thing that happened in the first New Zealand earthquake, where buildings with a little bit of effort could have been stopped to collapse. In other words, attaching the roof to the walls and make sure the main structural frames are strong. Bringing that up to the present code may be just so prohibitive that the owner doesn't want to do anything, and he'll leave it vacant and speculate on the property value going up. So is that what you want in your downtown core, which is whether the city's Ontario or elsewhere? So making them so they won't collapse is a real plus, right? And so that's the kind of thing that's as far as I'm aware, happening in Canada. I know the Victoria scene, I don't know other scenes in other places, but not provincially as far as I'm aware.
Again, if I can build on what you were sharing, but be really focused here. Building codes for the new buildings for the next generation. So your sense of the codes as they exist in Canada, and might you want to differentiate between the Canadian building engineering for earthquake and the Canadian building code for Port 9 buildings or for the larger structures compared to residential homes?
Yeah, there's two sections in the code. One is for big buildings that are designed by engineers, set of basic rules that you have to be met. In fact, and allowing that the engineer can design it himself with software usually done, and can go to the local building inspector and say, look, this is even better than what's in the code. And that's often what happens. The code is just design guidelines. And then there's the small buildings that are built by Joe Contractor according to the rules, certain nail density, and there used to be induction. I think there's still buildings of this by their very nature are earthquake resistant. So there were two big changes in small buildings, either small commercial buildings or or small residential buildings that engineers, and these not necessarily small, up to 4 stories can be built by Joe Contractor, at least in British Columbia. One was in 1965 when they made sure that all the small buildings were attached to their foundations. So that only applies, a serious thing, when you're in a really, really strong shaking, like you were in New Zealand, right? And I'll tell you a story about it in a minute, in New Zealand, and secondly, in the last building code, 2010, they required the ratio of window to wall area to be fixed. You cannot exceed that unless you have an engineer design the structure. So if you want all windows, you can have it, but an engineer has to sign it off saying that it is structurally resistant according to the building code. But Joe Contractor, I think it's 25%, I may be wrong on that, has to have at least 25% of properly nailed, wood, plywood oriented strand board to give the house some lateral strength, because glass does not have a lot of lateral strength. So those are 2 significant changes, but generally they say the phrase was in I think it's the commentary on the code itself, by their very nature and standards of construction, they are earthquake resistant. And in fact, UBC is maybe has a big giant shaking table, and they have one in California, and they built these structures on there, and they shake the hell out of them, and they survive very well. So wood frame structure doesn't mean it won't be damaged, but it's not going to collapse around and kill you. And again, that's the building code focus. Yeah.
Yeah, first I really enjoyed the talk, and I wondered how I can get this to be shared with some of my colleagues in the Caribbean, because we have many cities in the Caribbean with this exposure. But a comment on a question. First, I know you mentioned several times that the internet was robust enough in several cases to survive. Mm-hmm. And my thought is whether or not the emergency management community is really taking full advantage.
I think they are.
Building robustness. And the second question is how well did linear infrastructure, and in Canada they were interested in pipelines, but there are other kinds of linear infrastructure which are also vulnerable to liquefaction impacts. I mean, how will you survive across the spectrum of cases?
Well, certainly liquefaction did a lot of problems to linear infrastructure in Christchurch, right? But one of the things, if you have liquefaction, it's almost counterintuitive. Liquefaction means it liquefies, so it's liquid. And the waves that usually do the damage in earthquakes are shear waves. They do not propagate through liquid. So once the thing liquefies, it essentially insulates those buildings from really strong shaking. So when you're driving through the liquefied areas, you see, first glance, there's no chimneys down, there's no visible damage on the buildings, very spotty chimney damage. And you start looking closer and you see doors wired shut and buildings shifted off their foundations and, mud eject up the side of the house, right? So the strong shaking doesn't get through when it liquefies generally over a large area. So that's an interesting contradiction, right? You have one or the other. But yeah, it does not survive in those situations well. And again, liquefaction can be geotechnically engineered against if you know it's there. And so places like Richmond, south of Vancouver, which it knows it has vulnerabilities at different levels in the ground, if you're going to build anything there of any size, not your average 1 or 2 story house, but anything of any size, you have to do liquefaction studies and remediation, right? It's required, and it has been for decades. So a lot of that infrastructure is fine. Now, there's a lot of old water lines and stuff there that's going to be vulnerable during liquefaction that hasn't been designed in a modern world, but you can design against it if you know it's there. If you just go out and build, you got a problem. The one story I was going to tell about Christchurch is that the head of the Canterbury emergency response thing, the chief honcho, which is how I got in there because he had a connection with the Victoria guys. They went down in the first meeting, and I think they had a few beers together and identified with the first earthquake, and so they came down the second one, and they knew I was down there, and they were coming down, and I said, can I join you? So I became not a earthquake seismologist, I became an emergency manager and tagged along with them, which is how I got inside and learned quite a bit on how they functioned. And I was very, very impressed the way they were functioning in New Zealand. But his house is on the Port Hills, and it was a thrust fault, so a lot of the energy was up. And there was one strong motion accelegraph up there, and it's like 2G, which is twice the force of gravity. So he said, next to our sink, he said, house is fine, wood frame house, no damage. All stuff all over the house knocked down. But he said the sink was there, and we had a glass next to the sink we always used to keep there. And what was there after the earthquake, we went to the bathroom, was a pile of glass, broken. So that glass went up in the air and came down and shattered in place. So that's how strong the shaking was, right? And yet you move just down there into the liquefied area and you don't see any strong shaking because the strong shear waves didn't get at that, but the liquefaction distorted all these houses. So, but again, liquefaction is something you can design against with good geotechnical engineering. You have to know it's there, you have to know its extent, do some good geotechnical studies, and then engineer properly against it. And saying that's been going on in Richmond for a long time, but there's still older infrastructure there that hasn't, and there may be other places where people have built stuff and not, a long time ago and not realized the vulnerability.
So what's the date threshold in the Richmond area? Would you say prior to 1980s,
Certainly in the 70s, they were aware of this. I know several studies done by the UBC engineering group pointing out the hazard and delineating it, and the city council has been very vigilant since then, requiring somebody building any large structure to do the subsurface exploration and come up with a plan to mitigate against this.
So those properties won't collapse, but are they still going to have significant property damage in the Richmond area?
It depends on the shaking, right? I don't know. But, again, it depends where the liquefaction is. If it's 20 kilometers down in the ground, or if you put pilings and it goes right through the liquefied to something solid or beneath, it's not going to be a problem, right? But if that area, most of the vulnerability, I'm guessing, is probably near the river channels. If you have liquefaction at a certain depth, the river is cut out, I guess it's a free surface, and it just wants to flow that way. So we call lateral spreading. I showed you one example of that. And in Richmond's case, that's where most of the dikes are that keep the water out at high tide. So they have a plan with pumps and things and big yellow machines to fix the dikes so that it doesn't get all flooded at the next high tide, right? So they have been thinking about that for a long time. I'm not sure, because they know this vulnerability for a long time. I'm not so many other communities are aware of this or aware of this potential. And certainly, Christchurch, they had a problem? Most of the big structures in downtown had been engineered against this, more modern ones having better engineering in them than earlier ones, but they really hadn't thought about it in terms of the suburbs that developed out over this liquefied area. They mapped out the area, they knew where the liquefaction was, but the consequences hadn't been thought through, or if they had, they certainly weren't generally aware, and now they see what the problem. There were good liquefaction maps published before that earthquake happened of what was likely to happen, but actually what happened, and to say all of the infrastructure was probably the bigger problem, they learned.
If I can, in that area, I think you were sharing earlier that something like 7,500 homes in Christchurch are destroyed. That was largely liquefaction. They were not in that downtown core.
That's right.
Some shaking, but largely liquefaction. Last I heard from the government of Alberta, I think they'd agreed to 50 houses that were going to be taken away because they were in the floodplain and destroyed by water. And like the tone out of Alberta, you would think that there's a lot of homes involved, but so far it's 50. And here we're talking the scale. Calgary or Alberta's got 4 times the population, 5 times the population. He had a lot less homes just completely gone for these sorts of reasons. So liquefaction, this is a big story.
Yeah, it is. But again, it's a unique situation where all the liquefiable area there is very near the surface. That does not exist everywhere. So when, while Richmond has its problem, it's not the same problem as this.
Okay, we're going to draw toward a conclusion. Any last questions from anybody? Okay, before thanking Garry, just really quickly, our very next get-together is November 15. Ray Ness from the Toronto Region Conservation Authority is going to come and talk about floodplain management and what the authority is doing here in Ontario to manage flood risk. So with a reminder of November 15, thank you, all of you for your participation, and please join me in thanking Garry. I hope that was helpful to give a better understanding of the risks, and in particular, how to learn from elsewhere. That's still the best way, rather than having an earthquake ourselves, to learn from.
Yeah. So we're going to avoid that.
As much as we can. But it will happen eventually. Because we live here, they aren't. And if anybody has any questions, I'm available.
As always, we'll put a copy of the slides on the website if anybody's looking for them.
That's great.
Yep, great.
You got time for lunch after?
Sure. Mind if my wife comes on?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
wonderful.
Great.
It's a nice place across the street.
Okay.
You got a little Dave for me.
Absolutely.
Just talk
You
to
just-
us a couple days ago, but thanks.
The restaurant.
We've met,
Okay, sounds good.
I'm with the,
Sounds good.
use her phone.